Good afternoon. On behalf of Engineers Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Thought Leaders series, A Fair Net Zero Transition. My name is Amanda Rogers. Firstly, in keeping with our custom, Engineers Australia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders past, present and emerging. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that today's webinar is being hosted with Engineers Australia's industry partner, WSP. WSP is one of the world's leading professional services consulting firms. The company is dedicated to local communities and propelled by international brainpower. WSP comprises of technical experts and strategic advisors, including engineers, technicians, scientists, planners, surveyors and environmental specialists, as well as other design, program and construction management professionals. WSP designs lasting solutions in the transport and infrastructure, property and buildings, earth and environment, water and mining and energy sectors, as well as offering strategic advisor engagement and digital services. Today we will hear from our keynote presenter, Tania Constable, followed by an insightful panel discussion and audience Q&A. I encourage you to send questions through to our speakers via the YouTube chat box. And I'd like to welcome our moderator for today, Stan Krapan. Stan is an experienced CEO with a well-regarded track record, successfully delivering high-profile government programs and leading reforms in a number of sectors, including renewable energy, sustainability, health and safety, environmental regulation and the law. As CEO of Solar Victoria, Stan is responsible for the Victorian Government's flagship $1.3 billion Solar Homes program, as well as new initiatives including the Solar for Business program, Home Heating and Cooling Upgrades program, and Zero Emissions Vehicle Subsidy program, which will reach 1 million Victorians. Please welcome Stan Krapan.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Amanda, and welcome again to all of you, our audience. It's a real reflection on the relevance and importance of this topic that we've had more than 1,200 people register for this important webinar. Thanks for being here. I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's discussion, A Fair Net Zero Transition. I've worked in the area of climate change, sustainability and renewable energy policy for more than a decade. While my focus has been primarily government policy and program delivery, we work closely with industry as stakeholders and have had an active interest in the transition of business and industry in different sectors. I'm a huge fan of Engineers Australia work and the thought leadership demonstrated by EA for a profession that is so critical to this transition to net zero in all areas of sustainability, emissions reduction, renewable energy, environment protection, circular economy, just to name a few. I thought today's topic was an important discussion because it takes a broader view of the transition and explores the important topic of fairness. In 2015, almost 200 countries of the world, including Australia, signed the Paris Agreement with a commitment to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. More recently, the Australian government at Glasgow in 2021 committed to a net zero target for 2050. State governments, including the Victorian government, have set ambitious targets for 2030 on emissions reduction and targets for renewable energy generation. And just this Monday, the UN's lead climate body, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published its assessment of climate change impacts and policy responses focusing on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. The report indicates that climate change impacts are continuing to accelerate and that we will not be able to achieve the 1.5 degree commitment without a 43% global reduction in emissions by 2030. While Australian and international governments have stepped up their adaptation efforts, they are not keeping pace with the commitments made during the Glasgow Climate Conference, and more effort and ambition will be needed. As practitioners, engineers will have a critical role to play in the technological shift and innovation that will be needed, and indeed that we're in the middle of. But the transition to net zero is a societal transition as well, as much as it is a technological shift. It's been described as a socio-technological transition. We'll have to bring our communities along with us. Today's topic, of course, is how can we achieve net zero in a fair way that's fair for all. Reaching net zero may include phasing out or at least adapting entire industries and professions, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to increase participation, create a more equal and resilient economy with new jobs, sectors, and investments. To explore these issues, I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker for today, Tania Constable, PSM. Tania joined the Minerals Council of Australia in July 2018, where she's proud to promote and advocate for a strong, vibrant, and innovative minerals industry in Australia. Prior to joining the MCA, Tania was the Chief Executive Officer of the Collaborative Research Centre, the CRC, for Greenhouse Gas Technologies, a leading global research organisation testing carbon capture and storage low emission technologies in Australia. Tania previously worked as a Chief Advisor in the Personal and Retirement Income Division of Treasury, working on tax-related matters, and has had a long association with resources and energy, holding various senior executive roles in the Australian government. During this time, Tania also had the privilege of being the Australian Joint Commissioner and Sunrise Commissioner for Australia and Timor-Leste, leading joint activities on the development of the Joint Petroleum Development Area and Greater Sunrise Project. Please welcome Tania Constable.
Well, thank you very much, Stan. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting today. I'm presenting to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. There would be no modern mining without engineers. Your vital contribution ensures the industry is able to achieve tremendous success. So it's not surprising that many of our mining company leaders are engineers and will play a significant role in the industry's ambition to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. But we have a Herculean task before us all. For Australian mining, the task is multidimensional. Mining is our largest export industry. It generates huge returns for Australia, state and federal revenues, payments to local businesses and supply chains, wages and salaries for Australians throughout the country. Resources export revenue reached a new record high of $351 billion in 2021, up 21% from the previous record set in 2019, and 68% of a total Australian export revenue in 2021. The decadal contribution of mining to the economy is stellar. 2.1 trillion in resources export revenue, 246 billion in mining wages, and 21% of Australia's GDP growth over the last decade. Australia is the premier mining jurisdiction in the world, and the dramatic growth in Australian resources has enabled, in part, the extraordinary economic growth seen in the Indo-Pacific region over the last 30 years. This growth in our region required an expanded industry, and so great investments in the mining regions of Australia were made, expanding infrastructure and capacity, deploying new equipment and technologies, and employing more Australians in high-paying, high-value jobs. Mining today is a highly technical, sophisticated industry. We've seen this coast to coast, from the Pilbara in Western Australia to the goldfields of Kalgoorlie, through South Australia in the Northern Territory, to Queensland's Mount Isa region, Bowen Basin, New South Wales Hunter Valley, and even in Victorian Tasmania. In Victoria, we've seen a great growth in gold exploration and mining. As a massive Australian industrial sector, mining produces significant greenhouse gas emissions. We operate heavy equipment, moving billions of tonnes of earth across great distances, processing ores and raw materials into minerals and metals. Many mining facilities produce significant Scope 1 emissions, mainly from running diesel fuel trucks and equipment, and also from geological sources in the form of fugitive methane emissions. Mining is a significant user of electricity, particularly as we move downstream into minerals processing. To the extent that Australian electricity is still predominantly produced using unabated fossil fuels in coal and gas, our Scope 2 emissions are commonly reported by our companies and into federal compliance schemes. And finally, our products are inputs into virtually everything we see in the built world around us, from steel to copper cables, aluminium components, nickel, lithium, and other minerals for renewable energy and storage. The additional processing of raw materials into finished products invariably creates further greenhouse gas emissions, and so mining is aware of the Scope 3 emissions generated by our customers. Australian mining is diverse. We have large and small mines, open cut and underground, some focused on upstream ores production and others on complex processing, producing refined metals. We have bulk commodities and packaged minerals. You name a mineral and the chances are Australia not only has it, but is one of the major producers in the world. And across these, we have quite differing emissions profiles. Some commodities have significant Scope 1 and 3 emissions, such as coal. Others use a lot of electricity and have low Scope 1 and 3, but high Scope 2 emissions, like aluminium production. And Australia's massive iron ore industry has relatively low Scope 2 emissions, but operates massive diesel fuel trains and trucks, Scope 1, and has customers smelt the iron ore into blast furnaces using significant amounts of metallurgical coal, Scope 3. But the mining industry has started down the path of transitioning to net zero by 2050. There are huge commitments being made by companies by forging new partnerships and making bold first moves to decarbonise and future-proof whole regions, such as the Pilbara, as you'll hear from panel members today. The transition is not without impacts, and it is acknowledged by the mining industry that there is a need to avoid or minimise social negative impacts arising from this transition. In June 2020, the Minerals Council of Australia released the MCA Climate Action Plan. The Climate Action Plan was a clear statement that the MCA and all of its members are taking serious action on climate change and are committed to the Paris Agreement and its goal of net zero emissions. I would like to call out Mark Bonner, who is now with you in Engineers Australia, but led the charge with our members to develop the Climate Action Plan. The plan was the product of over 18 months of work to create a framework for the industry to cooperate on the task of decarbonising mining. Today, a plan of action amongst industries is rather common, but at the time, I'm proud to say we broke new ground. Our Climate Action Plan defined what we would work on and how we would communicate to stakeholders, governments, and investors. Our industry zeroed in on 3 key themes: transparency, reporting, and knowledge sharing. 10 actions supporting these themes and a host of some 30 activities of work over a rolling 3-year timetable. In June 2021, we issued the first progress report, which detailed the activities we had progressed, included an analysis of the Scope 1 and 2 emissions that MCA members were reporting into federal compliance schemes, and showcased a host of real on-the-ground activities underway by members. I'm pleased to say that in the first year of reporting, we smashed our Year 1 goals. In the first year of the Climate Action Plan, we surveyed members reporting into federal compliance schemes and found that members reiterated support for the Paris Agreement and the need to transition to net zero by 2050, or in some cases, well before. Abatement activities identified by members could reduce surveyed emissions by 30% per annum. Members identified some 39 abatement activities which were driving these emissions reductions, from autonomous operations to renewable energy deployment, to fuel switching, to battery storage, electrification, artificial intelligence, fugitive emissions reduction, tailings and water management, energy efficiency measures, and hydrogen fuel cells. Many of our members are collaborating with customers and partners to reduce emissions through their supply chains, including Scope 3 emissions. And I expect that this action will intensify over the coming few years. In October last year, the MCA also publicly announced the industry's ambition to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. It was a decision made earlier by the MCA board, but not released until we felt that Australia was through a major phase of the pandemic and governments were listening. This announcement reflected increasing confidence across all sectors of the industry to develop the technology and processes to decarbonise. Of course, we don't have all the answers, and we do not have a nicely signposted map to the final destination. Every company is different, every sector has its challenges, but each company and each sector has a pathway to net zero emissions by 2050 or well before. The mining industry will play our part. This is a journey that will take capital, board commitment, and CEO leadership. It will take technology and ingenuity, and in particular, maintaining a technology neutral outlook for the future. In the MCA Climate Action Plan, we state that to achieve net zero emissions will, amongst other things, require widespread deployment of all zero emission technologies. The MCA fully supports the rapid and effective rollout of renewable energy in Australia. This is having a great effect in reducing emissions in our electricity system and supporting the production of our own minerals and metals. Our members have supported this with more than just words. Look at Glencore taking the Mica Creek solar farm to stage 2 at Mount Isa. Look at BHP partnering with Iberdrola at Port Augusta Renewable Energy Park, and Rio Tinto developing its first solar plant at Koodaideri in Western Australia. Members are developing their own renewable energy projects and providing further support for others by signing PPAs. But this will not be enough to decarbonise Australian mining, the economy, or the world. We need to be open to technologies like nuclear energy, which will likely play a vital role in decades to come. Nuclear innovation is proceeding rapidly, with new designs coming through that are smaller, modular in fabrication, and complement renewable energy in electricity, with increasing penetration of solar and wind resources. And I believe that the government's decision to have a nuclear submarine industry for defence purposes in Australia will eventually pave the way for nuclear power in Australia, but unfortunately not in the near term. Similarly, carbon capture and storage, or CCUS, is a vital technology to develop and keep firmly on the technology roadmap. The IEA has in its net zero by 2050 scenario, which is just one possible pathway, a huge role for CCUS, with over 7 billion tonnes per annum being captured and sequestered by 2050, compared to just 50 to 100 million tonnes today. This pathway is essential for hard-to-abate industrial sectors such as cement and possibly steel. It will also be essential for the production of hydrogen and ammonia from traditional fuels. And with current high demand for coal in the Indo-Pacific and relatively new power generation using fossil fuels, CCUS hubs and solutions are critical for that region. There are few pathways to faster decarbonisation without including CCS technologies and nuclear energy. Yet we still see significant organised opposition to their development. And as I've explained to many stakeholders, it's vital we achieve an all-hands-on-deck approach. First, to bring forward renewables and other abatement options as quickly as possible, and to resist summarily dismissing all technologies that are needed now. We need every good idea, tool, and engineering solution we can get our hands on for global decarbonisation. So it's clear this challenge is huge for mining. We have complex, diverse operations and emissions across the full spectrum from scopes 1 to 3. But we also see tremendous opportunities. It will require us to develop new skills and technologies. It will require us to develop new resources for minerals. There is a need now for more copper, nickel, lithium, uranium, critical minerals, and rare earths, amongst others. These are the minerals that are widely used in modern life, from electrification of transport to advanced electronics and electricity generation. They will play a critical role in the transition to a zero emissions global economy. This is a tremendous opportunity for our industry and our country. It won't fall into our lap, however. We will need to continue the reform agenda, make our environmental assessment and approval processes more efficient and effective in enabling projects while protecting our environment. We will need to continue to be an attractive investment destination for resource development. One way our industry is endeavouring to do this is to adopt and adapt the Towards Sustainable Mining Initiative, or TSM. Developed in Canada, TSM helps minerals companies evaluate, manage, and communicate their sustainability performance and operationalise the MCA enduring values sustainability goals through a consistent, universal framework. We are genuinely excited about the rollout of TSM, as we are confident it will demonstrate the strong general performance on sustainability issues of our members and industry. I want to make some final comments on communities and transition to net zero. As I hope is now clear, we are committed to an expansive sustainability agenda, which includes working with communities and Indigenous stakeholders, delivering positive environmental outcomes, including carbon sustainability and good governance. Our industry is by its nature embedded in the regions, and we are acutely aware that our activities often underpin the economic viability of towns and communities in the region. A fair transition commences from the day a mine is planned until it is closed, and the future-proofing of our regions is essential. Planning for new minerals and mines is underway. Companies are investing to support towns and regions in planning for their long-term future. The transition to net zero will clearly wash through Australia's economy, and there is virtually no industry, region, or town that will not feel some change over the coming decades as a consequence. Our TSM framework and our long history of operating in the regions positions us well to navigate the coming changes. Today, more than ever, we're acutely aware of the relationship our industry has with its host communities. Like all relationships, they are never complete and always a work in progress, requiring continued building of trust based on communication and performance. So in conclusion, no challenge is insurmountable, and your bright, creative engineering minds and solutions alongside teams of others will assure us of that. Australian mining is the backbone of this economy and is in a prime position to seize new opportunities, to take the lead as advanced technology users, to become more efficient in every part of our operations, to develop new resource basins and projects needed for modern society, and to generate new wealth for our country. Thank you.
Thanks, Tania, for your insights. A terrific presentation there. Tania, unfortunately, will need to leave at 11:55, so I'm not sure if we'll get to throw her a question given that there's some technical difficulties, but I'll now move to welcome our panel for the day, starting with Julie Shuttleworth. Julie commenced as Deputy Chief Executive Officer in February 2018 and was appointed as the CEO of Fortescue Future Industries in August 2020. Having joined Fortescue in 2013, Ms. Shuttleworth has held general manager roles at both Fortescue's Cloudbreak and Solomon mines. Julie holds a double major in extractive metallurgy and chemistry and has 27 years experience in the mining and resources industry in Australia, China, Tanzania and South America, including 19 years in gold, copper, working for Newcrest Mining, Sino Mining and also Barrick Gold. Please welcome Julie Shuttleworth. I'd also like to welcome our third and final panel member, Paul Williams. Paul's the leader of WSP's Australian mining and energy business, working with clients, stakeholders and communities to shape the region's future and transition to green economy. He's passionate about pursuing new innovations that will help maximise the use of our existing asset base, improve the resilience of our communities and decarbonise the economy. With 25 years experience working across Australia, the US, Scotland, Korea and Indonesia, Paul is an accredited advanced facilitator with project director experience across a range of complex technical projects in the private and public sector. delivering innovative strategic and technical advice to mining firms, power generators, network businesses, market operators, financiers, investors, and regulators. Paul has worked to enhance the world's infrastructure across developing and growing cities. Paul's also a member of the Hydro Directorate of the Clean Energy Council, as well as the Energy Task Force for Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, and an advocate for energy matters across multiple bodies and organisations. Please welcome Paul Williams. So let's move to today's panel discussion on this critical topic about fairness in the net zero transition. Thanks to everybody who has submitted questions in advance. We'll try to address as many of these as we can. Throughout, we'll take questions from our audience, and we're already seeing some of those come through. Please ask your questions via the chat box, and please identify yourself or whether you'd like to remain anonymous when asking the question, and also if you would like to direct your question to any of our particular panel members. So I can't see Tania on the screen. I understand you have another engagement, but let's move to our panel. Julie, I wonder whether I could call on you as our first speaker, if you like, on the panel, and really provide some insights from your perspective on this topic of the net zero transition and fairness.
Fortescue Future Industries is the green energy arm of Fortescue Metals Group, and we're focused on making green hydrogen from renewable energy sources with zero carbon emissions. We've got two key objectives. The first is to decarbonise Fortescue's operations by 2030. That's the Scope 1 and 2 emissions. If we don't do anything, then Fortescue will be using over 1 billion litres of diesel per year by 2030. So we need to lead by example and solve for that. And the second objective is to make green hydrogen the most globally traded seaborne energy commodity in the world to replace fossil fuels. And we're aiming to make 15 million tonnes of green hydrogen by 2030 for the global markets. There's a huge opportunity here in Australia that we need to grab hold of to make this renewable energy, green hydrogen, green ammonia for those global markets. So that's a summary of what Fortescue Future Industries is focused on. It's very important that governments, communities, businesses, all stakeholders work together in this transition to renewable energy and grab hold of the opportunities that we have in front of us.
Thanks for that, Julie. Paul, can I call on you, your perspectives, net zero transition and fairness?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think I'll put it in probably three categories and just reflect on some of the comments Tania made as well. And especially when we talk about the aspect of fairness and not leaving anyone behind, or looking at, are we impinging or putting any greater pressure on those less advantaged than others? I think if we look at it in three streams, we can see it across consumers, market participants, and stakeholders. So let me just take a look at that at the moment in terms of consumers, and are they paying a fair price for their energy? And if we look at rooftop solar and we look at battery storage that's occurring within a marketplace and accessible to some, but is it accessible to all? And what's the fair way to be implementing that and having the right policy mechanisms for that to work? If we look at market participants, and I talk about that usually in terms of developers or those that are creating the new evolution that is the new system that will form over the next many years, and so support the Australian economy and also us as consumers as well. Look at access and knowledge, access to sites, access to the right sites. Are we perhaps putting some of these assets on great arable land that could be used for other purposes? Is there fairness in that? Perhaps how some may have greater access than others, but also the knowledge. We are moving through a time where there's a lot of innovation. Some may have greater knowledge than others and be able to move a lot faster than others. So is there fairness in that piece? And I noticed Tania did talk about a big part of their plan around transparency, reporting, and knowledge sharing being key with that as well. And then the last piece was stakeholders. And stakeholders, I think about everyone else that could be that those new energy pieces or changes we do to the system that will be impacted. So let's just look at farmers in terms of potentially, power lines or new power lines on their land, or the impact to them and to others potentially that may occur from having a stronger grid to take on the renewable development that we need to. Is that appropriate as well? And we can put in also Indigenous Australians as well. Is there a fair, way that they've been consulted and part of part of the change that's occurring. So I think that's important that we look at that as well. And just to the points Tania raised earlier, I think she said about bringing the community along with us and everyone feeling the change. Agree with that. Everyone will be feeling the change, and we have to bring those communities with us. So the important question again is the fairness of that, and are we doing that the right way?
Thanks, Paul. If I could stick with you just for a minute, it sounds like you're alluding to a risk there of getting to net zero either too quickly or too slowly for particular stakeholders. What do you see as the risks of that speed, if you like, of the transition?
And let me just talk a little bit, maybe I'll start with the too slowly bit. Probably originally, most people on this call would be aware that we've probably struggled with energy policy a fair bit in this country. And it was only probably 7-8 years ago that we were probably deciding on a renewable energy target and where that may land and sort of slowly chipping at it. We did have a carbon tax. We pulled back from that, a market mechanism to affect change. And then we went through a process where there probably wasn't much policy, or some would say no policy, to guide us and to direct us into how we'd like to see the energy system change over time. And when that occurred, you probably saw an initial slowdown. Investors were concerned, thinking about, am I investing in the right assets? What does that mean? People were looking for certainty. We hear that a lot in our investment community. You hear that a lot with clients as well, trying to invest in assets that will not be stranded or become white elephants down the road. So we probably saw a bit of a slowdown, or not only in terms of what we were putting out in terms of new energy assets and lines to support that, perhaps, or the infrastructure to support that, but we were slowly bottling that up. The queue was probably getting greater and greater. Our coal-fired generation were getting older and older. Something was going to occur. Now, and there seems to be a little bit much more of a support, not only for renewable power, but a lot of state governments have stepped up and pushed it quite a fair bit harder. We are seeing that surge come forward, and that increase in demand, not increase in demand, I suppose, but just that increase in investment appetite, and also the oncoming of projects being built. What that does, though, is it does shock the system a little bit in terms of capacity, capability, engineers through this call to support that. And able to build those projects out. But also, if we don't have the right legislation, policy, processes in place, some of those projects learn in a difficult way or aren't implemented as smoothly. Folks on this call might be quite familiar with the current challenges we have just around grid connection and connections across the NEM, probably because some of that thinking or those plans to put in place haven't been as smooth or as planned as what we would like it, given that initial slow period that we've had. So we're probably seeing now the impacts of running fast and running quite fast, and perhaps hurting a little bit more than what it should be in implementing that across the system.
Julie, there's a heap of questions that came out from your introductory remarks, but I'm keen to hear your views. We often talk about the challenges of the transition, but it seems to me in your narrative, and certainly your former chairman, or both chairman actually, narrative, it's all about opportunities. So how do we change the narrative in Australia to focus more on the opportunities than the challenges?
There's a huge opportunity that, firstly, we don't rely on other countries for our energy security. And Australia can grab hold of this opportunity to develop our renewables, make green hydrogen and green ammonia for the global energy markets. So we've got to grab these opportunities here in Australia. There's plenty of jobs that can be created as we develop this new industry. We've got new technology to develop and keep expanding, and manufacturing opportunities right here in Australia. And just to give some examples, FFI has already started construction on a manufacturing facility right here in Australia, in Gladstone in Queensland, and that will be the first phase. Many more phases to come after that. Every state and territory in Australia has got opportunities to develop this industry. And Stan, I might just reflect on, what's the risks of going too fast or too slow with this, and I would like to comment on that. Going too slow is that the planet is cooking. There's irrefutable scientific evidence now. You would have seen the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report coming out this morning. But if we don't do anything, to curb emissions, then the temperatures will just continue to rise. This century, to keep temperatures within 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to halve emissions by 2030. That takes serious action. And I think the risk that people have of going too fast is that they think the cost will be too high. But let me just reflect on what Fortescue did in the early days of starting our iron ore operations. Cost of making iron ore was over $50 per tonne. In less than 10 years, it was less than $13 per tonne. So you have to get the projects going, apply the technology, the innovation, apply the scale to the next project and get the flywheel turning to drive the cost down. And that's exactly what we need to do with renewable energy, green hydrogen, green ammonia. Get the flywheel turning, get the projects going, learn, apply the innovation, the technology to the next project, keep driving down the costs, and we need to start, otherwise Australia will be left behind.
Thanks, Julie. I'll start with you, Julie. The policy settings that we need to advocate. You talked about the planet cooking, so there's a sense of urgency about this. But what policy settings do we need to advocate for to ensure that the cost of transition is not unfairly borne by those who are economically disadvantaged?
Firstly, it's really important that the government invests taxpayers' money in the right areas so that we can support this full renewable energy, green hydrogen transition. This also looks at people like landowners, farmers, and making sure that they're not disadvantaged by this transition as we progress it. One example our chairman's given is that diesel fuel rebate currently costs taxpayers about $8 billion a year, which about 70% goes to large mining companies. So our suggestion is that over between 2025 and 2030, that this rebate is progressively transitioned out for the mining industry as we progressively decarbonise our operations. This is not to take it away from small businesses and farmers that absolutely need this to be successful. So that's one example of what needs to be considered to help with this transition.
Thanks, Julie. Paul, did you want to offer a view on that question?
Yeah, just around policy, what I'd sort of mentioned, and one that's been kicked around a fair bit in the energy sector or energy pricing policy has probably been tariff review or looking at our tariff system. So for those at home, when you still pay your energy bill, it's usually, you get a tariff 1, a tariff 2 and a tariff 3 as to the amount of energy you're consuming in those 3 months or 2 months or whatever that may be. It's probably right to look at whether that's still the right way to set pricing of power, because we do, our system is built for peak demand. When we are using large amounts of energy, particularly in summer, particularly when we're all turning our air conditioners on at the same time, is there a fair charge that we're all paying during those periods, as opposed to those perhaps with solar on their roof, and this is where this fair category comes in as well, may not be paying any power at that point, but still paying the same price potentially when that network is really used or utilised or needed. When the sun's just about to start setting and we're all turning our air conditioners on to keep the house cool, or whatever that may be. So that is one piece I know that's been looked around, but there's other pieces like that, as Julie's mentioned as well, that can be looked at with regards to policy. I would say also that there's some lessons to learn from other industries where consultation is key with the community when you're looking at policy decisions like that, and what a community is willing to pay for, because it's all taxpayer funds to some extent, or how the government directs taxpayer funds, and where the community also see those priorities. So keeping them engaged in that. The energy regulator, the AER, already mandates that through some of our network companies, where they have to go out and consult before they do their price reviews, their 5-year price reviews, with the community in terms of what their plans may be for the network. One other thing quickly I might just mention too, because you spoke about in the previous question, Stan, that was raised, just about, I think it was just about fairness as well.
Yep.
In terms of, sorry, I'm just the questions escaped me now, but it was just your previous question.
It was about policy settings and how do we make sure, what do we need to advocate for to make sure that people aren't left behind, I guess.
I think it was your question just before that, Stan, the one.
Well, the other one was really, I think you've answered that, which was the question about how do we advocate for opportunities rather than just challenges?
Okay, no, that's okay.
Yep. Okay, I want to come back to this point about social license, but just before we move away from you, Paul, you talked there about peak demand and the NEM and the infrastructure that's in place. So what infrastructure do we need to ensure that this net zero transition is successful?
I think the key to always remain with infrastructure is there's I think a term that Tania uses as well, is technology neutral, rather than trying to push one technology over the others. And the great thing for us and for engineers and for those on this call is that there's a huge change in the system coming, and a great time to be part of that. But rather than put one technology over the other, it's probably that we're going to see a greater mix of that. So if we're looking at things like solar, whether it's the wind, onshore, offshore, versus solar, versus battery technology, BESS, I'm talking about battery energy storage, versus pumped hydro, there's probably a use for each one of them across the NEMs and the value that they can add across the NEM and across that supply chain. We have parts in the country where we have certain wind patterns that support perhaps the wind blowing at night, or more so during the evenings, as opposed to in the mornings or in the afternoons. We also are a broad country where we've got time zone changes. We don't have an interconnected NEM probably to share energy across the whole lot, WA and Northern Territory being separate from the rest. But I think there are advantages to each one and what they could offer. Pumped hydro similarly as well, as to where you may place them in the network, where's the best connection points, and where there may be sites, and this comes back to that fairness argument again, where we've already utilised or we've had old mining sites or other quarry sites where they form great pieces of assets or potential future assets, like something like pumped hydro. So I think when you put all those pieces together, it's about different technologies playing to their advantage, as opposed to picking one or this one or the other.
Julie, what do you think about Paul's comments about the policy positions needing to be technology neutral?
Fortescue Future Industries is completely focused on renewable electricity, making green hydrogen. We don't need to support a fossil fuel industry. Putting taxpayers' money into continuing to support fossil fuel industry is not a good idea. You've got to look at what we've got to look at here is actually the end product and how many carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, are being produced for that megawatt per hour of electricity or the kilogram per hydrogen. And so when we look at hydrogen, for example, next month, the Green Hydrogen Organisation is releasing a hydrogen accreditation system globally, where we'll be measuring the emissions to make the hydrogen, and people can then choose, the consumer will actually know and be able to choose to buy their products based on the carbon emissions. Because when you look at, for example, grey, blue and green hydrogen and the various technologies behind those, you've got to look at, for example, the carbon capture and storage matter with blue hydrogen. It's not just capturing the carbon dioxide that's the issue, but it's when you use the methane and the steam methane reforming method. You're releasing methane into the atmosphere just through the production cycle to get the methane. And that's 80 to 90 times more global warming potential than carbon dioxide itself. So you've got to look at all those carbon emitting gases in the whole chain, the whole supply and production chain of that end result. And that's actually really important when we're deciding technologies. Actually, what we're trying to do here is stop the planet from cooking. So we need to make sure that that's what we're focused on. And that's why renewable electricity, green hydrogen made from zero emissions, green ammonia made from zero emissions is absolutely where the focus should be. We've got a huge opportunity in every state and territory in Australia to decarbonise Australia first, and then help the world to decarbonise with these practical implementable solutions.
Thanks, Julie. I've heard Andrew Fortescue talk about that rainbow of hydrogen. Not everybody here works in this industry, and certainly I'm probably one of the 1,000 people on the call that's not an engineer. Julie, just tell us, give us a thumbnail sketch of the difference between blue and green hydrogen.
So let me start with grey hydrogen. And hydrogen today is made through this process of steam methane reforming. There's a few other methods, but let me talk about this one. methane plus steam, CH4 plus H2O makes H2 plus CO2. So this is how you make hydrogen, and you get carbon dioxide, which obviously is a greenhouse gas, as is methane. So that's how about over 80 million tonnes of hydrogen is made today. Blue hydrogen is where you still use that same process, but you take the CO2 and you try and capture it, whether that's pumping it back deep underground. Now, that's been tried in many places, and we spent billions of dollars in Australia to try and get this to work. And around the world, there's been many projects trying carbon capture and storage. It isn't a technology that's proven yet. Many billions have been pumped into it. We've really got to focus on technologies that have got a pathway to working. So the risk of that is that you might capture some of the carbon dioxide, but of course, when you're producing the methane in the first place, there's all those methane emissions from production, from valve and pipe leakage, and that's those fugitive emissions which I spoke of. Carbon dioxide warms the planet, but methane warms it 80 to 90 times worse than carbon dioxide. So methane is a big nasty here. Then when you look at green hydrogen, we're taking renewable electricity from wind and solar, hydropower, geothermal, so no carbon in that electricity generation, to then apply that electricity to the electrolysis of water. H2 plus O2 is what's created, zero carbon emissions. And then, of course, when that hydrogen is used, there's zero carbon emissions along that whole chain. So that's why we're focused on renewable electricity and green hydrogen at FFI, Fortescue Future Industries.
Thanks, Julie. Let's stick with green hydrogen. I'll come back to you, Paul. I'm keen to hear your views on CCS in particular. Julie's put down the gauntlet there. But Julie, what do you see as the big uses for green hydrogen in the next decade, say?
So green hydrogen can also be then converted to green ammonia. And there's a huge market for decarbonising shipping. Shipping uses the dirtiest fuel on the planet, marine fuel. And as we all know, there's thousands of ships going around the world daily. We're converting a 75-metre ship that we've bought to run on ammonia to prove this can be done. And there's other companies also doing similar work. So if we can convert the global shipping fleet to run on green ammonia and clean up that whole shipping industry, that will be a huge achievement. So that's one of the first markets. Of course, then there's hydrogen that goes into making polymers, for example. One of our MOUs that we've signed in Germany is for a polymer manufacturer. Another one is for hydrogen to go into what it's doing now in normal industrial applications. It can be used for even heating homes, for example. But what we're focusing on in FFI is for decarbonising heavy industry, those hard-to-abate sectors. And we're also doing test work on using green hydrogen and green ammonia in making green iron and therefore green steel. There's a huge opportunity also. But we're not just looking at green hydrogen for that. We're actually using electrochemical reduction of iron ore using renewable electricity. And we've got our own internal scientists looking at that right now. So we're looking at various pathways to decarbonise steel making.
And Julie, you've just signed an MOU with Germany to supply green hydrogen. Can we really compete with Europe on these investments that are essentially fungible all over the world?
Australia has huge opportunity in every state and territory to develop wind and solar power to make green hydrogen and green ammonia that can definitely be exported to Europe. As everyone is aware, there's a huge energy crisis in Europe. They'll need to get energy from multiple locations. This is a great opportunity for Australia not to decarbonise our own country, but also to support Europe in their own energy security.
Paul, let's come to you now. Hydrogen is the topic. Blue, green, grey, brown. What's your view?
Way too many colours. I think the key is for, as engineers and in our profession, and particularly given in consulting engineers that we're in as well, is to be objective, fair and independent and provide that advice to clients like FFI or others in terms of making decision around what's the best way for them to move forward. Something we have noticed also as we move into net zero, it's about transition. I keep saying that the discussion is always about transition and shifting and moving the economy on where it needs to be. And I think as we make those shifts, not only will investors, but the boards, social license, which is very important to the mining community, or mining participants will play a key role in which way they shift or move into that. So we largely from a position where we provide that fierce, objective, fair and independent results. Independent reviews and others, or I suppose the voting public, to make that decision about which path that they undertake. But it's all about transition, making that fair. I suppose just quickly, the other thing I wanted to add to that, Stan, of the question that I spoke about earlier, was the one about opportunities.
Whoops. Yep.
Still there?
Yep.
When we spoke about
Paul,
opportunities, I think it's very important too that we talk about what are the opportunities for people in the marketplace. So things that FFIs do, it's fantastic to talk to young engineers, particularly folk moving into STEM, about what they can be part of. This will be one of those lifetime type changes and evolution of the energy systems. We are putting some of the newest, best kit out there in the market. A lot of the world is watching Australia. So it's important that for folks on this call to feel like this is a really important part of the sector to be part of right now.
Thanks, Paul. Both Julie and Tania mentioned carbon capture and storage. The IEA says it's an important part of the mix, not really proven anywhere at scale as far as I'm aware. Paul, what do you see as the future of CCS?
It has struggled, yes. There are reports saying that not quite up to it, and Julie's comment too that it is perpetuating or continues the use of hydrocarbons, and is that the way we want to go? You get on that slippery slope of not really transitioning, not really moving on. So I think there's certainly some arguments from that perspective in terms of CCUS. I think. As we also see technologies of other aspects continue to grow, to continue to move very fast, the cost of energy coming down, it's also economic rulers that may come across those industries that sort of said, well, maybe not quite the way to go.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Julie, you mentioned shipping, which seems to me to be one of these huge sectors and energy users that was largely bypassed in the Paris Agreement in 2015. So let's turn to the transport sector for a moment. What do you see as the key challenges or indeed opportunities for net zero in the transport sector?
Stan, I might just give some examples of what we're doing in Fortescue. Just last year, we converted one of our diesel trucks to run on hydrogen, and we converted a locomotive to run on ammonia, 80% in the mix. We're aiming to get over 95% to replace diesel. And we're doing that test work on the ship, like I mentioned. We also had a drill rig running on hydrogen. Our next step is to get these into our mine operating environment, to prove them in the operating environment, so we can actually then replace our entire fleet with this decarbonised and green equipment. So that's a focus on mining. There's obviously then the opportunity for locomotives globally to either run on renewable electricity or on green ammonia. And heavy haulage, long distance haulage, all opportunities for green hydrogen and green ammonia. Obviously the light vehicle market, where it makes sense to pump renewable electricity and to power up light vehicles. Let's use the electrons or the molecules in the most sensible place. That's our view on the transport sector, but plenty of opportunity, and we need to get cracking. In some cases, it will be converting those engines to run on ammonia, for example, like ships and trains. You actually don't need to replace the engine. Where it comes to running it on a hydrogen haul truck, for example, you'll be ripping out the engine completely and putting in fuel cells and battery into that. We're also running a battery electric haul truck, so we're trying just the electrical version. And also with locomotives, we're developing an infinity train. This is a concept which we can use in the Pilbara, where our mine sites are several hundred metres higher than the port. So we're taking our fully loaded trains downhill. These trains are about 3 kilometres long. And as they go down, they'll get the gravitational energy will be captured and put into a battery. It will be then offloaded, and through that recharging process on the downhaul, we'll be able to go back up the hill to reload at the mine with no recharging. So you don't have to stop for recharging. You don't need to put in recharging infrastructure. And this is our infinity train concept, which is being developed now. So when we talk about, we're not just focused on green hydrogen. It's green electricity, green hydrogen and green ammonia in the place where it works best to decarbonise heavy industry, and that includes transport.
It sounds like you're talking there also about the energy efficiency, if you like, of the production mechanism. So whether it's the molecules or the electrons, as you say, and put them to where it's of best use, but also there's an important efficiency aspect of that. What do you see as the importance of electric vehicles, Julie?
Where electric vehicles are running off renewable electricity, that is what we should be doing. The importance of electric vehicles is critical in decarbonising. This is a combination of green electricity, green hydrogen and green ammonia. With those three options, you can decarbonise the planet.
And lots of questions coming through about the infrastructure. Before I go to those, Paul, can I go to you about the opportunities and challenges in the transport sector?
Yes, so I think Julie mentioned quite a fair bit around, seeing electrification around the system, particularly when it comes to rail. We also have mining clients looking at their road trains, haul trucks. Just imagine something quite different where you've got catenary systems, almost like trams, running down roads to get ore from point A to point B. So perhaps quite a huge change to the system there. But the other issue I'd probably see, or that we need to work through with around electric vehicles, we're still at a small point of penetration of electric vehicles in Australia compared to where Europe is. There's probably quite a bit of planning we still have to do from a distribution network perspective of what that means for cities as well, and regional cities. The vehicles, we talked about technology moving, accelerating in terms of what you could receive today with regards to an electric vehicle, what was 10 years ago, particularly the distance they can go without charging, that has changed significantly as well. So as the technology moves, they are becoming a lot more, or considered more as an option for folk in terms of that could work for them. But where will they charge? What do we do with some of the existing petrol stations? Do they convert into battery swap outs? Bus and other light vehicles or public transport systems are looking at that as well. And where do you place those systems, and what does that mean for the grid again, and how the grid may need to change to support electric vehicles? So there's a few things that needs to be worked out as well, and coming down the pipe. And that question of fairness creeps in again. I mean, at one point, electric vehicles were very expensive. They are slowly moving down. But I think as I think all the speakers have mentioned, but also Julie's mentioned, that as you get more of this technology in there, that price point does come down, and that price point will have continued pressure on it. And then again, do we have the right policy settings for pushing electric vehicles harder?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So this is one of those examples where, the federal government's doing one thing, the state governments are now doing something else in terms of incentives. My own organisation, through the Victorian government, delivers incentives for electric vehicles, now copied in SA, I think, New South Wales and Queensland. So there is this move towards electric vehicles. I think at least in Victoria, the government's commitment is 50% of new vehicles by 2030 being electric. Is the infrastructure there, do you think, Paul?
I think there's still more to do on the infrastructure side and to build that out. We haven't been fully tested from that perspective yet, and we've got to appreciate too that our network systems are still built to an extent where they have to be quite responsible, or very responsible, for the dollars that they spend, and keep that as efficient and as low as possible. So, additional areas that they need to look at, you've got to put the right mechanisms in place for them to do that. I think that also relates a bit to this topic that we are talking about here, Stan, in that sometimes some of our systems are built for what we looked like in the past, or how we ran those systems, operated those systems in the past. And there might be a refresh needed on that as well.
Yeah. Let's come back to you, Julie. We've talked a lot about energy sources, if you like. You mentioned almost this concept of optimizing the energy sources, and I think Paul's also alluding to energy efficiency. What's the role of energy efficiency? Have we given up on it?
No, there's always opportunities to improve, but energy efficiency is an important part of this whole story, which is exactly why we need to use the renewable electricity, green hydrogen and green ammonia in the place that makes most sense. We all know it's going to take wind and solar resources, and then by the time you make hydrogen, then that hydrogen, if it's used for a fuel, is obviously not going to be as much energy in that as in the initial wind and solar. That's obvious, and that's why we have to use it in the most appropriate situation. But it's also important to recognise when we're looking at decarbonising those hard-to-abate sectors, particularly heavy industry, when you've got a practical implementable solution like green hydrogen and green ammonia, and there's no other renewable green solution, then you need to focus on that and looking at the technology for that, the efficiencies to be improved with that and driving the cost down. So that's why we have to find the most practical solution for whichever example it is we're trying to decarbonise.
Thanks, Julie. Paul, you mentioned peak demand. Now, what's the role of, say, optimization or energy efficiency in addressing peak demand?
Yes, and we still have a system, well, everyone still refers to the duck curve in terms of what we have or how our demand looks in terms of supply. But I think there's still a role that we need to play in that to alleviate that. Storage will assist with that, where that short-term supply that we need, also longer-term, something like pumped hydro. That's why I say it's very important that we focus on the mix of solutions rather than one versus others. But I think that will become an important facet to that regard as well.
Yeah, thanks. And Paul, the built environment plays a big role in this area as well, both energy usage, energy efficiency. We're talking about adding electric vehicles in huge numbers over the next decade. How is the built environment needing to transition and change to accommodate these new technologies?
So a big piece of what's part of the DNA in WSP, Stan, is our future ready approach. That's an important part of how we do business across our business in terms of where we explore all the future potential issues that a client or challenges may be reaching. That may be water scarcity, that may be living alone, or we see loneliness as being a factor in some of the cities that we're developing and building. Net zero is obviously one of them, a drier climate, for example. So I think when as a firm, we look through a lens of, the property and buildings we're developing, whether that be across our health sector or in defence or even new office space, whether that includes our transport business across how we design new structures around stations, connectivity, how people move around, and then also whether that be our water infrastructures too, most being gravity focused for less pumping, less storage. So we are looking at that all in the lens of a changing landscape ahead of us. So I know we talk a lot here about mining and energy. We have a lot of support for that. But there, as you said, there's a huge piece around the built environment where we are working with our clients around how to maximize that or how that may need to change. So, for example, in our property space around charge points, having charge points for EVs, catering for how people may mobilize or move in the future. Are we looking at more dense situations, particularly around, and what that might mean from a planning perspective, around stations or key hubs that we move to and fro, and to get greater connectivity with folk across a certain area, across a certain suburb. So I think it certainly is becoming important in the built environment, and people are looking at total solutions around not just energy, but water usage, or, to be as efficient and have the least footprint as possible. And we are getting those challenges from all of our clients placed on us as well. One other aspect I also mentioned that we're starting to look at is our carbon intensity in design.
Thanks,
so,
Paul. Julie, I might go to
we should be reducing that for clients.
Thanks, Paul. Julie, can I come back to you? So Paul's done a great job of bringing us back to the household level. What does this mean for regular people, if you like, in the next 10 years? Does hydrogen have a role in my life in 10 years?
Well, it certainly can. There is an opportunity to blend green hydrogen into the gas networks as a part of a transition. Depending on the pipelines, we have to do work here in Australia and globally. Which pipelines that are already in place can we push hydrogen through to replace natural gas completely in the future? But green hydrogen can be used in the household for heating, for cooking. This is a common use for that hydrogen can be used for. Now, if we're going to see that here in Australia, I'm not sure. It makes sense to put renewable electricity into the households as a priority due to that energy efficiency that we spoke about. But we will see it in the coming decade, the average consumer. But really, the key area for green hydrogen and green ammonia is in decarbonising heavy industry. An example, Stan, we've got two examples here in Australia that we're working on right now. And one is Incitec Pivot's ammonia plant in Gibson Island in Queensland. That's been previously running on that steam methane reforming process. We're going to be using renewable electricity to make green hydrogen to feed into the ammonia plants, and then that will be green ammonia that can be then used in all those areas that we use ammonia for, which includes for farmers in fertilisers. And the other area is AGL's coal plant down at Liddell. There's an opportunity to repurpose some of that infrastructure there to the renewable industry. So we can actually transition these heavy industries to go green, and there's some examples I've just given you that we're actually already working on.
Great. Julie, there's a lot of questions about the future of water and the importance of water and some of the trade-offs in using water for hydrogen as opposed to other uses as a natural capital. What's your view on that, Julie?
It's really important when we develop these projects that we take into account all those environmental aspects. Water is a key part of the green hydrogen production process. So where the water comes from for the project does depend on where the project's located. Here in Australia, most likely that we'll be using seawater to desalinate it for using in these processes. And then, of course, there'll be numerous amounts of studies to make sure that when you pump the salty water back into the ocean, that those current is in a space where the currents can take it away, and dilution means that it's not an impact on the local environment. This is really important for FFI and for everyone as we develop the renewable industry, that we manage the water.
Paul, we're talking about natural capital. You're encouraging us to take a broader view of energy and the transition. What do you think the role is of biodiversity and natural capital as we move to this sort of net zero renewable future?
I think it's a piece that we definitely keep in the forefront. We're already seeing challenges like that occur across the sectors in both mining and energy, probably more so in mining, Stan. If we look, for example, at mine closure, where we may have sometimes environmental versus environmental impact, as in which one may be better or better positioned. If we look at, for example, tailings, and we were to have a smaller footprint that we put that on, and pump more tailings at a higher level or truck it up, we may have more energy costs, more diesel, potentially we'd be shifting from that, you would think as well. But that's a smaller footprint as opposed to having a larger tailings dam or tailings piece that has a larger footprint on the landscape, which is the better outcome. So I think it's important to keep the factors of environment right there and biodiversity, and to work through those as we see those challenges come up. As I think it was mentioned before, this is a complex piece. Mining and energy has gotten more complex. So there could be scenarios like that we'd have to map through or work through.
Thanks, Paul. Julie, in a former life, I did some work with CSIRO, which has done a lot of work in the mining sector around a model for social license. Obviously, FFI and your parent company take a strong view of social license. What can we learn from the mining sector's experience with social license that can be translated into the net zero transition?
Really important that local communities and local stakeholders are communicated with, engaged in this, and they benefit from this as we develop the transition to renewable energy. Obviously, landowners, traditional custodians, towns and communities, they all need to be consulted and be part of this journey. So, a big part of this is also providing training, jobs, and those job opportunities and opportunities for local businesses. And that's exactly what the mining industry does well. Fortescue's spent a lot of effort training and developing people from the local communities and giving Aboriginal people a lot of opportunities that they might never have had otherwise. And that is something that we can make sure transitions across to the energy sector as we develop these opportunities across Australia. And we must do that.
Paul, you talked previously also about social license. Take a broader perspective than mining. How important is social license, and how do we achieve it?
Very important. Across my mining clients, yes, it's almost been built into as of late in terms of social license and what that means, not only from an environmental perspective, NGOs that could be looking at projects, but also Indigenous communities, as Julie has mentioned. And I think that is something that is now moving very much across into the energy industry as well. You'd be familiar, Stan, with some of the, I suppose, as well, Julie, as well, the large transmission lines we may be looking to build across the country, including here in Victoria, but also those associated with Snowy 2 to get that energy power, that source of power out. We are, for the first time, probably in a long time, we've built lines of this nature, and we are seeing a lot more communities stepping up and looking at it a little bit more critically in terms of why aren't we looking at undergrounding options, or what are we doing with regards to bushfire mitigation. So it may have been in the past that we've been able to build or more easily develop those lines or to connect renewables in the past. But we are looking at, again, quite a significant change to the NEM and what that may look like. And so there are a lot of questions out at the moment and a lot of consultation that needs to be done just with regards to implementing those solutions.
There's a really strong theme in the questions coming forward about these new industries, new innovations, not creating new externalities that we then have to deal with and mop up later. In the case of hydrogen, I think there's a question of around the NOx or SOx. Julie, I want to come to you on those externalities. And one probably for me, which is about the thoughts of disposal of those first generations of solar panels that we have on our roofs. We're getting cheap solar panels coming in. They're cost competitive, but there's this pressure to get the more efficient, the larger systems and that sort of thing. And I know that there is a strong view both in Victoria and SA and New South Wales around recycling those panels. And we do have a number of technologies that do that, that recycling. Julie, those externalities that are mentioned, and I have just lost the question and can't remember if it's a NOx or a SOx, but you'll know. It's a nitrous oxide, I think it is. Julie, how are you dealing with those externalities?
Lucky I know, because I'm I studied chemistry, so it is NOx. So when you burn ammonia, you can release the NOx, nitrous oxide gases. And so how we're dealing with this, clearly when you're putting green ammonia into ships or trains, what we don't want is to create then another issue, i.e. NOx. What we can do is what we will do is put in a scrubber, and you can use the ammonia that you've already got there as a fuel with the catalytic converter in this scrubber, and that ammonia combined with the NOx will then make that into nitrogen and water. So you are then making two inert products from that NOx and the ammonia. So that is the scrubbing system that will be put on all these systems that will burn ammonia.
And Julie, ammonia is used essentially as a storage medium for hydrogen as well, allowing it to be transported long distances, etc. Are there other technologies we should be looking at for storage?
I'm glad you raised this, because transporting hydrogen is challenging. It has been done now. Once there was that shipment from Australia to Japan. So that technology is being developed and needs to be continued to be worked on to transport liquid hydrogen over ocean transport. Now, why liquid hydrogen is difficult is that minus 253 degrees Celsius is needed to transport liquid hydrogen. And to transport ammonia, you need about minus 30 degrees Celsius. And ammonia is transported globally very regularly right now. So this is another reason why ammonia is a big part of this mix. Firstly, it can be used shipping, trains and other areas, fertilisers, of course, to decarbonise those industries. But as a transport vector, you can then at the point where you want to use the hydrogen, if it's hydrogen the customer wants and not ammonia, you can actually convert that ammonia back to hydrogen. And one of the technologies that we've developed with the CSIRO is called metal membrane technology. And you take the ammonia, dissociates into at a few hundred degrees Celsius, dissociates to nitrogen and hydrogen. That hydrogen can be captured very purely and then be used where the customer needs it. So that technology is being developed at commercial scale. It's been used in several places now. That's one of the methods we can take the ammonia back into hydrogen.
Paul, what's the future of energy storage in Australia?
Oh, definitely a bright future for, if you're talking battery energy storage in Australia. At the moment, most of the developments we see around new generation, whether it be wind, solar, includes some form of energy storage as well, just for better management of the grid, other commercial advantages of that as well. And we are seeing that accelerate. Today, I'm actually going to celebrate with a client one of their storage projects. So it's certainly something that we see growing, not just in Australia, but globally as well. If I just come back to the other question too that was mentioned, Stan, around, some people raise comments around, the circular economy and what are we doing about, some of the panels that we have now and suppose cleaning it up going forward. One thing I would say, going into a new sector like this, there will be a learning path. And with innovation comes trials and tribulations, come some things that maybe not go as well, or learnings we take from that. And I think as we move on that trajectory, we will learn certain elements about certain aspects that we will no doubt further clean up or further address. And some of it will have a footprint of some type. It's just how we minimise that. So I think what folks will see is that not only will we move along this journey, but we'll also learn on this journey as well.
There's a great question about battery recycling. Obviously, batteries are going to be a huge feature, whether they're large scale, they're getting bigger and bigger every week. It seems that there's another announcement interstate. But even at a home level, I know with my organisation, Solar Victoria, we're seeing this 500% increase year on year now in battery take up for households, becoming more and more popular, more and more economical. Can the batteries be recycled, Paul?
I'm not, unfortunately, unlike Julie, I'm not a chemical scientist, and you probably can't go into that into any significant detail to talk from. But what I can say, certainly advances. Well, we're certainly seeing that as well in terms of that uptake. And I would say that I've heard it being discussed at more barbecues you could poke a stick at now in terms of how even people are managing their own energy system. So we're seeing the consumer move pretty fast from that perspective as well.
Julie, do you have a view on battery storage?
In terms, yes, well, battery storage, we need to keep developing that. The renewable energy transition does need forms of storage. Batteries is one of them. There are others. Hydrogen alone itself is one. But in terms of batteries and recycling, we need to keep focused on this. We have our own manufacturing team here in FFI, and we are very much looking at battery recycling for the future. Of course, that is going to be critical. Those minerals that we have, we can't waste them and just throw them away. We need to actually get this circular economy moving.
So let's cast the crystal ball forward 10 years. It's just 2032. We've gotten past the critical decade. Julie, what does it look like for a household in Australia in the context of the energy transition and the transition to net zero?
Well, we need to be having ourselves running off solar and wind power. We need to obviously have stable grids and cheap prices of power is all part of that. And everyone will know that the cost of fossil fuels is going up. So we just can't keep relying on them and saying it's cheaper than renewables, because it isn't, and it isn't going to be in future. So we really need to get serious about looking after our own energy security and the planet at the same time, creating heaps amount of jobs and doing the right thing. So our households, they will be different then, not just our households, but where we work, the industries around us. And it needs to be, otherwise this planet is going to cook itself.
Paul, what does it look like? Let's talk about the energy mix, 2032.
I just quickly from a home perspective, I think Julie's right in terms of, my energy will probably be totally supplied in terms of solar and batteries with the plug-in and probably most likely 2 cars that are electric. As opposed to that, not at the moment. I would also think that you're going to see more digitization, more digital application, more automation. These are smarter assets. So you're coming back to the energy mix now, Stan. I think someone once described our NEM and our energy system as a dumb system. It will be a smart system going forward. It will be, we are managing assets using drones, looking at, and we are watching them in every different way in terms of, how much energy we're getting from solar panel 1,270 versus others in a solar farm. So I think a digitized space as well in terms of how we're managing our assets going forward, repowering when it's ready to shift, all of that.
Paul, let's stick with you. This is, after all, an Engineers Australia event. We've got 1,200 people registered for this event. How can engineers throughout Australia and the globe become involved in this fair energy transition, and what needs to change?
Great question. Like to see more people in STEM. I would say in the last few years, we've probably noted, that people have questioned a little bit of the mining and energy space in terms of, is it moving the right way? Is it clean? Is it something that I can be involved in and the legacy it leaves behind? But where we're seeing it right now, and even with Tania's opening presentation in terms of the change that's going to happen, not only in the mining industry, but across the energy system, it's the most exciting time to be part of it. It's the most exciting time to change that system and be part of that change. As an engineer, we talked about before when we built the system of the past around hydro and what that meant for immigrants in the country at that point in time. What will it mean right now for those that will be part of the new energy system going forward, whether joining a company like Julie's or ours, in terms of what that change and being part of that change could look like. If we remain on that path, also staying focused on transition, being objective, being independent, with the best advice out there for folks to make the right decision going forward, I'm sure we will get that right. But an exciting time to be an engineer in this space.
Thanks, Paul. Julie, over to you for the final word. How can engineers throughout Australia and the globe participate in this fair energy transition, and what needs to change?
This is a hugely exciting time for engineers and everyone globally to participate. It doesn't matter if you've got experience in renewables, green hydrogen, or green ammonia already. Most people don't. So actually those engineering skills you already have can be applied to this transition, whether that's renewable energy, power, water, grid connection, mechanical engineering, whatever range of engineering for these huge hydro projects and others. This is critical time for engineers to get involved. And it's not just engineers, it's just anyone that your skills that you already have, tradespeople, logistics people, service support people, they all can apply to this sector. What we do need is innovative thinking, entrepreneurial thinking, people that are willing to push and think outside the box. We've got to get these projects going. We've got to test the technology. We've got to keep improving. That's the way we're going to drive the cost down and make this so positive to help save the planet. So great opportunity for everybody to get involved if you're interested. Just imagine being involved in taking a 400-ton mining truck, running it either on green hydrogen or running it completely on battery electric, running off renewable power, not spewing out any diesel fumes anymore, and making our mine sites go completely green. And then look at all the industries across Australia and the world that we can decarbonise. Wonderful, wonderful opportunity for everyone.
Indeed, it's not just about the existing engineers, it's also about attracting new people to the profession and also all the adjacent professions that build from it. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm left inspired by those closing comments. That's all, unfortunately, we have time for today. It was an incredibly knowledgeable and inspiring session. Thank you to you, Julie, and to Paul. I'm sure our audience has enjoyed this wide-ranging discussion as much as I have. But we're not here just as spectators. Everyone plays a part in driving change, as Paul and Julie and indeed Tania have said, and social dialogue is going to be key to the transition. will need to collaborate to create the future, and community support and social license will be important to the success of net zero plans, policies and projects. As practitioners, how will we take account of some of the things that we've heard today? What will you take forward from today's session? Please join me once again in thanking Tania Constable, Julie Shuttleworth and Paul Williams for their time and input and incredible insights. I'd also like to thank Engineers Australia and their industry partner WSP for making our webinar possible. Please complete a short feedback form which is linked in the description box below to help us improve and plan future sessions. EA would like to advise nominations for the Engineers Australia Excellence Awards, People and Projects. The nomination websites with further information are linked in the description box and today's feedback survey. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next Thought Leaders event. Thanks, everyone.